The November rain hammered against my penthouse windows as I watched Mom's silver Mercedes pull into my driveway. 23 floors above Manhattan's Upper East Side, I could see everything. The way she sat in her car for 5 minutes, probably rehearsing her performance. The way she checked her makeup in the mirror before stepping out. That familiar, calculating look in her eyes. My hands trembled as I adjusted the hidden cameras one final time, knowing this Thanksgiving would be our last. The FBI surveillance van across the street looked like just another delivery truck, but I knew Agent Martinez was watching every move. Today, Victoria Chen would finally learn that her daughter Sarah had grown claws. The woman who raised me to be her perfect little accomplice was about to discover I'd become her judge, jury, and executioner. Mom swept through my front door like she owned the place, her Hermes heels clicking against the marble floor with that arrogant rhythm I'd learned to fear as a child. She wore her signature black Chanel suit, the one she'd bought with money stolen from my college fund 15 years ago. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, not a strand out of place, and that cold smile she reserved for her victims was already spreading across her surgically enhanced face. "Darling, you look wonderful," she purred, air-kissing my cheeks while her predatory eyes scanned my living room, no doubt cataloging every expensive piece. The scent of her perfume, Tom Ford's Black Orchid, brought back memories of all the times she'd worn it while manipulating me into her schemes. I forced myself to smile back, knowing that in a few hours, that same perfume would be all that remained of her freedom. "I've made your favorite," I said, leading her toward the dining room where our last supper awaited. The table was set with my grandmother's china, the same grandmother whose inheritance Mom had stolen and gambled away in Atlantic City. Golden turkey, cranberry sauce, and sweet potato casserole filled the air with the scent of tradition. But underneath it all was the metallic taste of betrayal. Mom's eyes lingered on the new painting above the fireplace, a Monet reproduction that had cost more than most people's cars. "Business must be good," she said, her voice dripping with false pride and genuine envy. I nodded, knowing she was already calculating how much she could take from me this time. What she didn't know was that I was calculating too. Every stolen dollar, every broken promise, every night I'd cried myself to sleep wondering why my own mother saw me as nothing more than a bank account. The meal passed in a blur of forced conversation and plastic smiles, Mom regaling me with stories of her latest investments while I pushed food around my plate. She'd aged since our last encounter 6 months ago, stress lines creeping around her eyes despite the Botox. Her hands shook slightly when she reached for her wine glass, and I wondered if the gambling debts had finally caught up with her. "You know, Sarah, I've been thinking about that vault of yours," she said casually, as if discussing the weather. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my expression neutral. "The one Daddy had installed for you before he died. Such a sweet gesture, rest his soul." The way she said it, with that slight mocking tone, made my blood boil. She'd never respected Dad, never understood that the vault was his way of protecting me from her. Now it would be the trap that finally caught her. As we finished dessert, Mom excused herself to use the bathroom, but I knew where she was really going. Through the security monitors hidden in my home office, I watched her creep toward the basement, her heels now silent against the carpet. She moved like a ghost through my house, checking corners and doorways with the practiced ease of a seasoned thief. The basement door opened with a soft creak, and she descended into the darkness where my father's vault waited. My hands were steady now as I activated the final recording devices, knowing that every step she took was being captured in high definition. Agent Martinez's voice crackled through my earpiece. "Target is in position. All units stand by." I closed my eyes and whispered a silent apology to the little girl who'd once believed her mother loved her. That little girl was about to watch her mother fall. The vault door stood open like a mouth ready to devour its prey, and Mom stepped inside with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Stacks of cash lined the walls, $500,000 in neat banded bundles that looked like heaven to her desperate eyes. She didn't notice the serial numbers had all been recorded, or that each bill had been marked with invisible ink that would glow under blacklight. Her breathing was heavy as she filled her purse, then her jacket pockets, moving with the frantic energy of an addict getting their fix. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered to the empty vault, but her actions betrayed her words. She wasn't sorry. She was exhilarated. The thrill of the theft, the rush of easy money, the power she felt over her own daughter. It was all there in her flushed face and bright eyes. She had no idea that upstairs, federal agents were already surrounding the house. "Find everything you were looking for?" I asked from the basement doorway, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Mom spun around, her face cycling through surprise, fear, and finally settling on that familiar manipulative mask. "Sarah, honey, Your father asked me to check on his old papers down here." The lie rolled off her tongue so easily, so naturally, that for a moment I almost believed her myself. But the bulging purse in her hands and the guilty flush on her cheeks told the real story. "Really? Because it looks like you were stealing from me. Again." The word "again" hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. She straightened her shoulders, trying to regain her composure, but I could see the panic creeping around the edges of her practiced calm. "You don't understand, darling. I'm your mother. What's yours is mine. That's how family works." The audacity of it took my breath away, but I'd been preparing for this moment for months. "You're right, Mom. Family is important," I said, pulling out my phone and showing her the live video feed. "That's why I wanted to make sure our whole family could see this moment." Her face went white as she realized what she was looking at. Herself on camera, red-handed, stealing from her own daughter. The FBI agents were already in position upstairs, waiting for my signal. "The cameras have been rolling for hours. Every word, every move, every dollar you just put in that purse, it's all recorded." Mom's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the cornered animal underneath. "You little bitch!" she snarled, lunging toward me with her manicured nails extended like claws. "You set me up! Your own mother!" But I was ready for her, stepping back as Agent Martinez and his team poured down the basement stairs. The woman who'd taught me to lie, cheat, and steal was finally going to face the consequences of her own lessons. "Victoria Chen, you're under arrest for grand theft, money laundering, and fraud," Agent Martinez announced, his voice professional and cold. The handcuffs clicked into place with a sound like breaking bones, and Mom's face crumpled as reality hit her. "This is about more than just tonight, isn't it?" she asked, her voice small and broken for the first time in my life. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. For 18 months, I'd been working with the FBI, documenting every scheme, every theft, every life she'd destroyed. Tonight was just the final piece of evidence they needed to put her away forever. "You were never going to stop," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "You would have taken everything from me, just like you took everything from everyone else. The woman who'd given birth to me, who'd sung me lullabies and kissed my scraped knees, was also the woman who'd stolen my childhood, my trust, and my ability to love without fear." The federal agents led Mom up the basement stairs in handcuffs, her Chanel suit wrinkled and her perfect hair disheveled. She looked back at me one last time, her eyes filled with something I'd never seen before. Genuine fear. "I'm sorry, Sarah," she said, and for the first time in my life, I thought she might actually mean it. But it was too late for apologies, too late for redemption, too late for the mother-daughter relationship I'd always dreamed of. "I know you are," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "But being sorry doesn't undo 28 years of damage." The front door closed behind her with a finality that echoed through my empty penthouse. I stood in my living room, surrounded by the remnants of our Thanksgiving dinner, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. The nightmare was finally over, but the healing had only just begun. Agent Martinez returned an hour later with paperwork and questions, his kind eyes filled with concern for the woman who'd just sent her own mother to prison. "Are you okay?" he asked, though we both knew the answer was complicated. I was okay in the sense that I was finally free, but I was also orphaned, alone, and carrying the weight of a betrayal that would haunt me forever. "She'll probably get 15 to 20 years, he said gently. "The evidence is overwhelming, and with her prior record, the judge won't be lenient." I nodded, knowing that justice was being served but feeling no satisfaction in it. "Will you be all right here tonight?" he asked, glancing around my suddenly too quiet penthouse. I assured him I would be, but after he left, I sat in the dark by my windows, watching the city lights blur through my tears. Tomorrow, the news would break, and the world would know that Victoria Chen's daughter had finally fought back. But tonight, I was just a broken woman mourning the mother I'd never really had. The next morning brought reporters to my doorstep and headlines that screamed about family betrayal and justice served. My phone rang constantly. Journalists, lawyers, and old friends who'd suddenly remembered my existence. But the call that mattered most came from Detective Sarah Williams, a woman who'd been tracking my mother's schemes for years. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice warm with genuine gratitude. "Victoria destroyed so many lives, stole from so many families. What you did took incredible courage." I stared out at the city below, thinking about all the other victims who might finally get closure. "It didn't feel like courage," I admitted. "It felt like survival." She laughed softly, understanding in her tone. "Sometimes they're the same thing. You gave voice to everyone she silenced, strength to everyone she weakened. That's the real victory here." As I hung up the phone, I realized she was right. This wasn't just about catching a thief. It was about breaking a cycle of abuse that had lasted generations. The trial began 3 months later, with Mom looking smaller and older in her orange jumpsuit than she ever had in her designer clothes. I testified for 2 days, laying out the pattern of manipulation and theft that had defined my childhood. The prosecutor painted a picture of a woman who'd used her own daughter as a pawn in increasingly elaborate schemes, someone who'd stolen not just money, but trust, innocence, and love. Mom's lawyer tried to portray her as a victim of circumstances, a gambling addict who'd lost control. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, witness testimony, and most damning of all, the video of her stealing from my vault. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict on all counts, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, but the little girl inside me still mourned the mother she'd never really known. The sentencing hearing was packed with reporters and victims' family members, all waiting to see Victoria Chen face the consequences of her actions. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, listened to impact statements from people whose lives had been destroyed by my mother's greed. An elderly man who'd lost his retirement savings, a young couple who'd been evicted from their home, a charity that had been embezzled out of funds meant for sick children. Each story was a knife to my heart, a reminder of the pain my mother had caused. When it was my turn to speak, I stood on shaking legs and looked directly into her eyes. "You taught me that family means never having to say you're sorry, because you just take what you want," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "But I learned something different. I learned that real family protects each other, supports each other, and tells the truth even when it hurts. I'm sorry I couldn't be the daughter you wanted, but I'm proud to be the woman you never thought I could become." The judge sentenced Mom to 18 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 12. As the bailiff led her away, she looked back at me one last time, her mouth moving in what might have been, "I love you," or "I'm sorry," or just a silent scream. I couldn't tell, and I realized it didn't matter anymore. The woman who'd given birth to me was gone, replaced by a stranger in handcuffs who'd chosen greed over love, manipulation over honesty, and theft over trust. I walked out of that courtroom into the bright spring sunshine, feeling lighter than I had in years. The cameras followed me to my car, reporters shouting questions about forgiveness and justice and whether I'd ever speak to my mother again. But I had nothing left to say about Victoria Chen. My story was about Sarah Chen now, about the woman who'd chosen to break the cycle, to speak truth to power, and to turn her pain into purpose. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of my new nonprofit organization, surrounded by lawyers, social workers, and financial advisors who'd committed to helping families recover from financial abuse. The walls were covered with thank you letters from people we'd helped, pictures of families reunited with their stolen assets, and newspaper clippings about legislative changes we'd advocated for. The Chen Foundation has recovered over $3 million in stolen assets, my assistant reported, her voice filled with pride. We've helped 47 families and testified before Congress about the need for stronger financial protection laws. I smiled, thinking about how Mom's greed had inadvertently funded the very organization that would help her victims. The irony wasn't lost on me, but neither was the healing. Every family we helped, every dollar we recovered, every law we changed was a step toward the justice my mother had always escaped. The vault she'd robbed had been empty of everything but money, but it had been full of something far more valuable, the evidence that would finally stop her reign of terror. The Foundation's first annual gala was held on Thanksgiving night, exactly 1 year after Mom's arrest. The ballroom was filled with survivors, supporters, and lawmakers who'd committed to fighting financial abuse. As I stood at the podium, looking out at faces that had found hope after despair, I felt a deep sense of purpose. A year ago, I watched my mother steal from me for the last time. I began, my voice carrying across the silent room. She took money, but she gave me something far more valuable, the understanding that we have the power to stop the cycle of abuse, to protect each other, and to turn our pain into purpose. The applause was thunderous, but what moved me most were the tears I saw in the audience, the recognition of shared trauma and collective healing. My mother thought she was stealing my future, I continued, but she was actually giving me my calling. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, but the work would last a lifetime. As the evening wound down, I stepped onto the hotel's terrace, looking out at the city lights that had once seemed so cold and distant. Detective Williams joined me, now a close friend and board member of the Foundation. "Any regrets?" she asked, her voice gentle in the night air. I considered the question seriously, thinking about the mother I'd lost, the childhood I'd never had, and the trust that had been broken beyond repair. "I regret that it took so long," I said finally. "I regret all the people she hurt while I was still too scared to speak up." Williams nodded, understanding the weight of survivors' guilt. "But look what you've built from the ashes," she said, gesturing back toward the ballroom where victims had become advocates, where pain had become power. "Your mother may have taught you to steal, but you learned to give. She taught you to lie, but you chose truth. She taught you to hurt people, but you decided to heal them instead." Her words wrapped around me like a warm blanket, and I realized that the little girl who'd once feared her mother's footsteps was finally, truly free. The last chapter of my story isn't about revenge or justice or even forgiveness. It's about transformation. Every morning I wake up in my penthouse overlooking the city, but I no longer see it as a fortress protecting me from the world. I see it as a lighthouse, guiding other survivors toward safety and healing. The vault in my basement has been converted into a conference room where families meet with counselors and lawyers. The space where my mother stole from me has become a place where we give back to others. Mom writes me letters from prison sometimes, filled with apologies and promises to change, but I don't read them anymore. Not because I haven't forgiven her, but because I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require relationship, and healing doesn't require her participation. She made her choices, and I've made mine. The daughter she raised to be her victim became the woman who stopped her victimization of others. And in the end, that's the greatest victory of all.